Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Melanie Schlotterbeck, and we have a presentation today by one of my colleagues on the Partnership Coordinating Committee. So we both serve on the committee that the Secretary Crowfoot established through the California Natural Resources Agency, and it's kind of the connection to nonprofits, indigenous tribes. We've got, gosh, natural resource groups. We've got hunters and anglers, folks that focus on conservation districts. We've got a variety of individuals representing a variety of topics. And so that is where I met Skip. And Skip is the Chief Operating Officer of Natural Resources Group, which is a mitigation and conservation banking company. And they're based in Central California, but doing work in a variety of locations. And they're looking at getting a little bit more established in Southern California. So we thought this was a good lineup for what we were doing. And by training, Skip is a wildlife biologist and has worked in this industry for over 20 years, especially focusing on mitigation, conservation, and restoration projects throughout California. So today, what we're going to learn about, and I'll hand it over to Skip to share his screen, are mitigation and conservation banks or banking that involve the permanent protection of management of sensitive habitat for its natural resource value. And in doing so, the bank sponsor receives credits that can be used to offset the permitted mitigation requirements of project proponents. And that's a lot and a little bit complex. So I'm sure Skip's presentation is going to explain a little bit more about that. But Skip, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Melanie. Let me work on sharing my screen real quick. It's been one of the most fun things about getting to be on the PCC with Melanie has been getting to meet a bunch of new people and realize that there are these different groups in the state who are doing incredible conservation work, and not all of us know each other. So it's been really fun to get to meet Melanie, talk with her about all the work that she's been doing with Hills, and find out how many nonprofit groups who I don't really have a whole lot of interaction with are operating throughout the state. So it's been really cool and really mutually beneficial, I think, to get to know everybody. My presentation today is going to focus on some of the basics of mitigation and conservation banking. Hope to talk for about maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And then happy to answer questions now. And then all my contact info is on the beginning and ending screens here. And happy to answer questions that folks might have in the future as well. So, like Moni said, I'm a founding partner and COO of Natural Resources Group. We're headquartered here in Clovis in Central California, just outside of Fresno. But we have mitigation and conservation projects throughout the state. I'm on the 30 by 30 PCC. Also currently the president of the California Ecological Restoration Business Association, which is a industry trade association that's focused on folks who are in the mitigation space, but also doing various sorts of environmental work, typically more of a for-profit endeavor. I am, like Melanie said, I'm a wildlife biologist by training. Went to school in Santa Barbara and did my graduate work at Fresno State. Right out of grad school, I started in habitat banking. And then over the course of my career, I've done something on the order of 30 projects. And inside of this mitigation space, done about 35,000 acres of conservation. A little bit about Natural Resources Group. We were founded in 2013. We've got 16 projects that are either approved or in development, totaling about 12,000 acres. Our biggest project is a little over 3,000 acres, and our smallest project, which I'll get to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, is about 23 acres. And we've done anything from our Wings Landing tidal habitat restoration project, which is a tidal saltwater or a brackish water salt tidal marsh restoration project in San Francisco Bay, all the way down to we're working on we just wrapped up a new Western Joshua Tree conservation project in LA County. So, and then we're working on some new banks down in North County, San Diego as well, our Paula Hills Bank. A little bit about mitigation. Uh, Mitigation really is the idea that a person who has unavoidable impacts to resources, be it species or waters, typically, and at least in my context, has to compensate for those unavoidable impacts. On the right, you have sort of that traditional hierarchy that folks go through when they're trying to develop a new project, be it an infrastructure project like renewable energy or roads, or a housing project. The first goal is always to avoid impacts, to try to site the project in a spot where you're not going to have impacts. It's the best way to do it. If you are going to be citing a project that's going to have some impacts, the next goal is to minimize. We want to reduce the level of impacts, right? These are the hierarchy that a developer would go through. At the very end, if you can't really avoid, minimize your impacts, the next move is to compensate for those impacts, and that's where we come in. There are really three main delivery mechanisms for compensation. These are on the more on the private sector side, um, not including things like HCPs and NCCPs. The first, and these are actually ordered in a hierarchy of preference, are mitigation banks, in lieu fee programs, and then permittee responsible mitigations, PRMs. There's also a new player on the scene, a fourth strategy, the RCIS, which a lot of folks have heard about. It's been spun up in the last couple of years. Um, I would say it hasn't gotten to the point where there are a lot of projects in the ground yet, but there's a lot of work that's been done framing up these new RCIS projects. Banking in nationally is sort of governed by the 2008 compensatory mitigation rule at the federal level. And then the Fish and Game Code, Chapter 7.9 on conservation banking sort of outlines the state statutes for conservation banking. The image on the right is a bunch of service areas that are pulled from a federal database called Ribbits that tracks all of the mitigation banks. It's run by the Army Corps of Engineers. But banks for federally protected resources, at least according to Ribbits, have contributed to over 100,000 acres of conservation, I think statewide and probably even larger than that nationwide. Actually, quite a bit larger than that nationwide. CDFW actually has just developed a new dashboard tool also for their banks. So you can see the banks that are CDFW approved as well. If it's only CDFW approved, it won't show up in Ribbits, and vice versa. Banks can be approved by a variety of state and federal agencies, including California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's one of our main banking partners, as well as some of the regional water quality control boards. On the federal side, typical partners include U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and if there is a wetland restoration component, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA. We are seeing interest also at a municipality level sometimes for banks. So a county maybe is interested in signing on to a bank that has a particular resource that they're looking to protect. I've talked with another PCC member about LA County's tree ordinance and potentially doing a bank to satisfy needs inside of the LA County tree ordinance. So it's a concept and a tool that is gaining in popularity and really allows private investment into the conservation space. So banking basics, what is it? It's land that's conserved in advance of impacts. And sometimes you'll hear it described as advanced mitigation. Um, they are typically established, like I said, with private sector investment. There are some exceptions in Southern California where public entities have gotten involved in banking, but generally throughout most of the rest of the state, they are private sector investments. There are two types of banks, as we describe them. There are mitigation banks, which is kind of a catch-all term. You'll hear mitigation banks used pretty broadly. Um, but inside the industry, it really is a connotation for a bank that involves wetland restoration. Conservation banks are typically used for species banks or for banks where there's just wetland preservation. You'll hear them used interchangeably. I'll probably use them interchangeably, but if you're thinking about it specifically, mitigation banks are generally wetland restoration. Conservation banks don't have a wetland restoration component. So I think some things are really common to all banks and important things to think about, especially in the context of if you're trying to do mitigation a different way, maybe permittee responsible or an in lieu fee program, they have different sets of constraints and requirements. Banks all have these same features. One, the very first thing is a bank enabling instrument. That's basically the agreement between the bank sponsor who's promoting the bank or developing the bank and the regulatory agency or agencies that are signing off on the bank. It's very common to have multiple agencies sign on to a single bank enabling instrument. Also not uncommon to have a single agency bank. That's really common too. But oftentimes we'll have overlapping resources with things like species and wetlands. We'll end up with, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Army Corps all on a bank. Those agencies together make up a thing called the IRT, or your Interagency Review Team, and they're the group that approves your bank enabling instrument. Inside of the bank enabling instrument, the number one tool for land protection is the conservation easement. Each bank will have a nonprofit partner, and they will be the grantee of that conservation easement. It's always an approved 501c3 nonprofit organization. That conservation easement is permanent and creates permanent protection of the land. It's not a term easement. It's not a deed restriction. It is a proper and strong permanent conservation easement. That conservation easement also references back to the bank enabling instrument and the management plans. Each bank will have management plans that govern sort of the long-term, short-term, and actually development of these bank projects. Development plans are really used for wetland restoration projects where it describes how you're going to do your wetland restoration. The interim plan describes basically a time in between when the development plan is done, if you need one, and when the long-term plan kicks in. And then the long-term plan obviously is a long-term management plan. These plans are developed for each of the resources that are being protected as part of the bank. Each bank has a set of resources that are protected. And these management plans are specific actions for the benefit of those species or habitats. Each bank will also have an endowment, also granted to a third party, may or may not be the conservation easement holder, that is non-wasting, meaning that the primary capital contribution that goes into the conservation easement doesn't get touched. Only the interest generated gets used for operating the bank. And basically what that does is provide for the perpetual implementation of those management plans. It's a really great tool for creating projects that are permanently protected and have permanent management money, which is something that I know a lot of folks struggle with in developing preserves outside the mitigation space. Is there's not a lot of times there's not headline grabbing money for doing management. There's a lot of headline grabbing money for acquisition, but management's really important and is one of those things I think everyone's starting to realize is an important component of good land conservation. So our endowments are basically established to run with the property. They live with the property. If the property changes hands, the endowment stays there, lives with the property, lives with the conservation easement and the management plans, so that there's perpetual management and funding for that management inside of our bank. And then each bank will have a service area. Think back to that map that I showed earlier with all the big polygons. Each bank will have a service area, and the species or habitats that can be mitigated at that bank will be inside of that service area. So we won't have a project for in LA County that will mitigate for impacts in Sacramento County. Just we want to have biological relevance. And so oftentimes our service areas are based on watersheds if they're water related, or they'll be based on habitat distribution, distinct sort of population segments, genetics, those sorts of things. We try to develop service areas that are biologically relevant, but also big enough to encompass a large enough area where there will be enough impacts to really warrant having a bank in the area. Talk about a couple of pros and cons of banking. One of the nice things about banks is that most of them, like I said before, are driven by private sector investment, and private capital can move really quickly. We can get a call from somebody that says, hey, we know about this important piece of property that's going to be coming up on the market for sale. It could go to development. It could go to conservation. Can you move in and snag this piece of property? Or sometimes we run into landowners who aren't interested in working with government agencies or nonprofits for some reason, and we can move in as a private landowner and do those sorts of acquisitions. Another nice thing, or like a tool in the toolbox for us, is that we don't have to purchase land with an appraisal, and we're not tied to grant funding cycles or maybe grant dollars that are are in jeopardy from time to time. So again, the right piece of property comes up, we can make a business case for it. We can go in and take private capital and do those sorts of acquisitions. The land is restored and protected in advance, which is really great. The historic way of doing mitigation was to do a bunch of individual projects, and so you'd end up with small, sort of less biologically relevant impacts. If your local, neighborhood apartment builds in a vernal pool or something, you end up with a 1 acre vernal pool project. It's not really biologically relevant. So what banks are able to do is take a wider area of impacts and consolidate them down into a one biologically relevant piece of property. So rather than having 100 1 acre vernal pool projects that might not make a big impact, we could do, a single 100 acre vernal pool project that has a lot more biological defensibility. And then again, the keys to all this are permanent protection, permanent management, and permanent funding for that management. Some of the cons of banking were sort of what I alluded to about the service areas. Banks are driven by permit demand. We're at the tail end of most project proponents' permitting process, so they'll go through CEQA, CISA, all their entitlements. At the end will come a need for mitigation. The downside is there are projects that we don't get to do. There are cool things, cool species, cool habitats that we don't get to protect inside of our framework. So we're really just another tool in the big sort of conservation toolbox. If something is extraordinarily rare or extraordinarily unique, probably not a great fit for banking because what we actually need to have happen is to have impacts happening in some spots and protection in another. So I run across neat projects that I don't get to do, but those maybe are a better fit for other types of conservation funding. The lands are also protected only for the resource. The wildlife agencies really think of this as very narrow protection just for the resources being protected. That manifests itself in a couple different ways, but one of the big ones is that there's really little or almost no public access on our projects. They're private property, they stay private property, generally speaking. And also because we have really defined management plans, there isn't money often for things like public access, trail maintenance. In the future, I'd love to see banking get opened up to public access because I'm afraid that sometimes we do a little too much of the lock it up and throw away the key type of conservation. Um, but inside the current framework, there's very, very little public access. Um, a criticism you'll sometimes hear of banks also is that they are sort of narrowly tailored to that species or that resource. So maybe we're not doing a restoration project that maximizes its benefit for everything. Maybe it's maximizing its benefit just for a targeted species or just for a targeted habitat type. The other big constraint is that these projects are really capital intensive. From land acquisition up front all the way through entitlement, these processes can take, these days, the process is taking somewhere between 3 and 5 years. So you can expect to, on top of your land acquisition budget, have potentially several $1 million of investment up front before you can begin to sell credits and make a return. And that ultimately is what we're doing. We're creating, through our entitlement process, um, bank credits that we can then sell to outside needs. I thought I'd take a second to run through one of the Southland projects that we have that was recently well, no, it was recently approved, I guess, in 2023. It feels like it was recently approved. This is our Big Tahunga Conservation Bank. It's in the northeastern sort of corner of the city of LA. Our easement holder is MRCA, who I'm sure you know, and our endowment holder is NIFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Project is just about 2 miles north of urban Sunland, Tahunga, located on Big Tahunga Creek in the Big Tahunga Canyon. We're actually surrounded on 3 sides by the Angeles National Forest. And this is our smallest project. This is the 23-acre project. You'll see it's a combination of sort of oak, woodland, chaparral on that sort of northwesternmost corner. And then the main channel of Big Tahunga Creek in the riparian area that's associated runs from sort of the north east to the southwest corner. Just to give you a sense of the timeline for our project, we made first contact with the property owner back in 2013. After a fairly lengthy due diligence process, we ended up purchasing the property in 2016. From 2017 to 2021, we were going through our entitlement process. That was building that bank enabling instrument document. In 2022, the bank was approved, and then we could start our interim habitat management activities, which included a bunch of restoration and cleanup. The credit types that we established on this bank were for the first ever Santa Ana sucker credits. Big Tongue Creek is one of the most westerly reaches that has a native population of Santa Ana sucker. There is another population, I think, in the Santa Clarita area, um, and it's got sort of mixed history on the genetics there. But in any event, it's one of the more westerly reaches of Santa Ana sucker native streams. We have 1,600 stream bed credits that are approved through CDFW. And we got the first in the state also, Southern California ESU mountain lion credits. So this little project tucked into the corner of the city of Los Angeles has two really unique credit types. And this project, I should say, was approved in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW. There was, before we got our hands on the property and were able to do our restoration work, a fair amount of destructive usage of the property. A lot of trespass, water impoundments, which are not uncommon on Southern California creeks for swimming, are really not great for the Santa Ana sucker. So people will build little artificial dams to make swimming holes. But again, not great for the sucker, and actually encourages things like crawdads and catfish and other species that wouldn't be typical of these sorts of streams. We had some religious ceremonies happening where we're getting a lot of inputs of animals and fruits and vegetables and things, just stuff that adds a lot of nutrients to the water that wouldn't be great. Driving a lot of invasive species. And then we also had some hunting. As we looked in our trail cams, we'd spot people using the property quite a bit. And the invasive species, I should say, also include things like arundo and Scotch broom. So when we got the project approved, we went in and started our restoration and enhancement work, which included fencing, signage, about 600 feet of trail remediation, a bunch of invasive veg removal, some parking that had been established that was sort of not supposed to have been established along Big Tongue Canyon Road or Big Tongue Road. We started taking down those artificial dams. All in all, we ended up hauling out about 40 cubic yards of material, which is a ton of junk. Filled up 160-gallon trash bags with broom and trash. Here's a picture of some trail remediation. The picture on the left was sort of pre and then post on the right. And this really helped cut down on the sort of attractive nuisance that trails can be um, in a project like ours. Again, no public access, private property. We really tried to limit any outside access. Here's some pictures of the arundo removal. And actually, there's a lot of Scotch and Spanish broom in this riparian corridor as well. One of the interesting things that happened too, I should say, on this bank was we knew there were lease bells vireo in the area, and lease bells vireo would be a credit that we could have received in the bank. Um, from 2014 to 2022, we've been doing lease bells vireo surveys using listening devices and both protocol and non-protocol surveys, and never detected birds on the bank project itself. We had heard and seen birds downstream. We had seen them upstream as well, but never actually using our property. And for LBV credits in this area, the agencies really wanted to see birds on site. But the amazing thing was that once we got the project approved and able to implement the restoration plans, the very next season, we had a breeding pair of vireos. This is one of the male vireos singing on a branch actually in the riparian corridor. And then not long after that, we saw them with chicks and ended up watching this nest and seeing the chicks fledge. So now we will go back through an amendment process and look to add lease bells vireo to our approved credit list. That's it for me. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, but I appreciate the time. Appreciate Melanie making a space for me to share what I do in a little bit of additional detail and how mitigation and conservation banking fits into the broader conservation framework. And be thrilled to get to answer questions.
Yeah, so we can spend, the next 5 or 10 minutes doing questions. Appreciate the information. Maybe I'll start with one of my questions, and then if folks have questions that are on the Zoom right now, feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you or drop something into the chat. So I think my question would be based on the recent federal decision to redefine take. How has that or will that impact the banks that you're creating?
Good question. And I will say all of the federal activity in the last couple of months has made it hasn't negatively affected banking yet. I will say it's really been difficult on our federal partners at the Corps and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The uncertainty of it all. The nice thing about banking is that we're not tied to grant funding, so we don't have the same constraints with things being frozen that other folks might. Um, It'll be interesting to see how this potential change in the interpretation of harm affects banking. Under the federal context, people who have impacts to potential habitat will oftentimes have to mitigate, and that can drive them to compensate for those impacts inside of a mitigation or conservation bank. So ultimately, our process probably won't be affected in that interpretation, but our customer base, I guess, could be affected. So if folks now aren't having to compensate for losses of potential habitat, then we could see a decline in need for our projects, and then downline probably fewer projects if that were the case. It would actually, we're hoping that the state actually has a more narrow definition of harm as well. So, in this context, it would be great if the state also had a broader view of what harm was, so we can really do compensation and land protection at the habitat scale instead of at the individual scale.
Great. Appreciate that answer. It's complex and a lot of moving parts at the moment. And
Absolutely.
there were a lot of moving parts to begin with, so this is just one more thing
Right.
to have to deal with. Does anyone on the Zoom have a question that they'd like to ask Skip? I don't. Oh, Vicky, go ahead. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm still not very certain about the funding for these mitigation banks. You say it's good for private investment, but I am pretty unclear about where you get all this private investment and why it seems to be forthcoming.
Great question, Vicky. Thanks. I would say that there is a movement inside of the private capital world to try to focus on doing projects that have bigger benefits as well. So you'll see that in things like the carbon market has private sector involvement, and banking is one of those tools where the private sector has been able to find a return that drives additional investment. Us personally, we've gotten capital from basically like family offices, folks who are interested in having a conservation component to the work that their family does. We also often will partner with private landowners who are interested in doing conservation, but maybe want to find a higher return than maybe just selling a conservation easement. Um, but there are a lot of folks and a lot of capital that's sitting on the sidelines trying to get into the mitigation banking space. Again, I think because it has an opportunity to develop a return. Now, some people have an ethical objection to that idea, but truthfully, in my mind, these impacts are happening already. Many of our main customers are actually public sector clients. So folks like Caltrans, DWR, LADWP does a lot of mitigation. So there are things that are happening, and banks really are a tool to help offset the impact that's coming down the line. So, um, there's no restriction to a public entity doing a bank, other than to say that the agencies are really concerned about making sure that we don't have um, private mitigation happening on publicly protected lands, basically providing a public subsidy for the true cost of the mitigation. Our projects are new protection that goes in, not land that was protected by grants or anything else. So we have the developers, the people who have the impacts, actually bear the full and true cost of the mitigation that's being done.
Thanks, Skip. Andrea.
Okay, so I'm not clear about one thing. I mean, like, there's this real estate project that is interesting going in Ventura County, and I guess they're covering up. I don't know the details exactly. I've heard it second, third hand. They're covering up a riparian area, a place that takes in floodwaters a lot of years. It's not a good place to build, from what people have said. Would your banking go towards purchasing the land or buying a width of the land to protect, or how would it work?
Well, let me answer your question a couple different ways. If the goal was to protect that property so that it couldn't be turned into whatever the new land use is, then a banker could come in, acquire that property, restore it, conserve it, and then at the end of the day, they'd end up with credits that they could sell to other folks maybe in the area who have projects that are um, that need riparian mitigation, road projects, culvert replacements. Those are the sorts of things that generally will happen in our smaller riparian projects.
So it's
Um,
more like the guys who are doing this nasty project would be able to give their money to something else.
So that would be the other angle to this, and it's a criticism that you'll sometimes hear of mitigation conservation banks, and one that we're happy to sort of talk about head on, is does the availability of a mitigation bank or a conservation bank sort of facilitate development? And my response to that would be not really. It could help that project fulfill its compensation obligations, right? But they should have theoretically gone through that hierarchy of avoiding, minimizing, and then compensating. And if at the end of the day, they've done a project that's met all the rest of the regulatory approvals from the state, feds, and county, then and they need to compensate, then being able to buy at a bank allows them to do that work in hopefully a much more biologically relevant kind of way. The alternatives oftentimes are things like in lieu fee programs, which take the money, and they work great when you need them, but they take the money and then they accumulate money and then go do a project. So the mitigation is happening in arrears behind when the actual development happens. Um, PRMs or permanently responsible mitigation projects can be scaled such that they're biologically relevant, right? Big solar projects in the desert can do big conservation projects. A little project like this, if all they need to do is well, Andrea, how big is the project roughly? If you had to guess, 5 acres, something like that? 10?
It's bigger.
Okay.
I don't really know.
Okay. So
20.
let's say it was a 5 acre project and all they had to do was mitigate for a 1 acre impact. Well, doing a 1 acre stream restoration project from a long-term durability and funding perspective maybe isn't as biologically relevant as if they had a 100 acre stretch of a stream, or even, in our area, the 23 acre stretch of the stream is relevant for Big Tahunga. So and that will oftentimes happen, I should say, in arrears also. So after the project is developed, they go and do the mitigation. So, it's a tough question. Ultimately, for bankers, the question is not one of like, is the impact good, bad, or otherwise? We don't tend to make value judgments on those things. If it kicks out of the permitting process, we trust that the state, federal, and local regulators who are responsible for doing that work have done it. And at the end of the process, in terms of acquisition of compensation, we're going to do the very best that we can on the compensation side.
So you showed that map in the beginning that showed areas that were darkened.
Mhm.
And you said that it was mitigation mapping. So those areas have a bank already established so that you could apply to those banks? How
Yeah.
would you how would you know what bank to apply to?
So the Ribbits tool is run by the core, and that was a snapshot of Ribbits. And I popped the map back on, but it might be cumbersome to try to go and reshare. But each
Yeah.
of our banks has a service area. And what you saw on that map was all the service areas. So there was a bank inside of each of those differently colored polygons. So what you would do is if you had an impact, you were, I don't know, building a house or something like that, you'd go to your own neighborhood, you'd find your project location on the Ribbits website, you'd click on it, and that'll actually populate a whole bunch of different uh, uh, service areas that cover cover your house, the house, right? So if
Okay,
you
how do you spell ribbits?
RIBITS, and I'm sorry, I'll get Melanie links to both the Ribbits website and the CDFW website, and she can pass them out unless somebody more adept at multitasking can snag them and put them in the chat. Um,
Thanks.
but you can, yeah, Ribbits is a great tool. It's not a totally inclusive tool, but you can, the state and federal wildlife agencies and the wetland regulatory agencies should have a comprehensive list of their bank projects as well that service their area. So again, your stream project in Ventura that you're describing, it's not going to mitigate at Big Tahunga. It's too far outside of our service area. Um, you're going to need something that's likely, on the Ventura coast, where it was within your specific watershed.
Do you have to have some sort of organism that's threatened that's in the
No,
project area?
banks will work on habitat types as well, but again, they have to be regulated, right? So you have to be getting some sort of a permit. So you'll have wetlands only banks, which are really common. And then you'll have species banks and sometimes combinations thereon. And then like sometimes it's a combination of wetland and species bank, like a vernal pool project would be that has endangered brachiopods.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Andrea. Mike and then Pam.
I think Pam was actually first.
Okay, she put her hand down and then came back into the game.
Yeah, I didn't want to eat up all the time, but it's kind of a quick question. The management funds, I have a conservation easement in San Diego, but it didn't come with any management funding. Are the management funds fluid across projects, or are they pretty much nailed down when the mitigation bank is created?
They're pretty much nailed down, right? So they are specific to that individual project. The money is actually by, I don't know if it's actual statute or just by interpretation and regulation, aren't allowed to actually be used on anything outside of our projects as well. In some ways, it's kind of a shortcoming because, like on our Big Tahunga project, we're going to be cutting down arundo, but there's a bunch of arundo upstream. So every time it rains, we just get more arundo. I'd love to see those sorts of conservation dollars be applied to when it makes sense to regional conservation efforts. But as it stands right now, Pam, the regulations are such that the monies are specifically attached to each individual project and can be only spent on those projects. The way we fund those endowments is as we sell credits. This is the typical way. As we sell credits, a portion of each credit sale goes into the funding of the endowment, such that by the time about 75% of the credits have been sold, the endowment's fully funded, and then we have to wait a couple of years to make sure that we don't have any wild swings in the stock market. And then the interest that's generated in that endowment then begins to fund our long-term management plan efforts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and we're quickly running out of time. So Mike, go ahead and ask your question and we'll wrap up there.
Yeah, it might be a little bit too complicated, but do the mitigation banks typically go through a CEQA process to show that they're fully compliant ahead of time? I know that VMT mitigation banks are a thing, and sometimes they're not going through CEQA processes now. And so I'm just trying to understand, is that the standard process to set one of these up in order to make sure that it's fully compliant and that all the process is set up ahead of time?
Good question, Mike, and it's project specific. So the conservation banks, where there isn't an earthworking component, typically aren't going through CEQA. They're not really a project in the CEQA sense. Just the recording of a conservation easement and the establishment of a bank doesn't amount to a discretionary action that creates a CEQA need. As I understand it, I'm not a CEQA expert, so if I'm misspeaking, I apologize in that respect. But generally, our conservation projects don't. Our mitigation projects, where we have earthwork and wetland restoration, typically will go through CEQA permitting. Our Wings Landing project, the one that was a 300-acre tidal marsh project, absolutely CEQA, CISA, ESA, the whole 9 yards. So where there are likely to be or possible impacts, we'll go through all the standard regulatory processes.
Great. So Lee, we are out of time, but if you want to email me your question, I'll make sure to get it to Skip and we can get it answered. I do want to thank you all for joining. We're going to go ahead and wrap this session up. Skip, thank you so much for your time. If you're available to share your PowerPoint, I can send that out with the video link as well, which I hope to have posted in the next 24 or 48 hours. And feel free to email me any questions directly, and unless you got Skip's information off of his PowerPoint. So appreciate everyone's time today. And for those in the Southland, I encourage you to stay on for the remainder of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Melanie. Appreciate the
Thank
time.
you.